This poem was written just earlier this month by UU minister and poet Lynn Unger. It's called Origin. In the beginning, the world was a great big mess, topsy-turvy, helter-skelter, the grandest celestial mishmash of time and space. Creation is the imposition of order, light from dark, day from night, water from air, and so on. Sometimes it works. Sometimes your carefully crafted plans tick down the rails of your decisions, running neatly on time. Sometimes not. Creation is a blessing. The careful construction of beauty and the delicate elucidation of truth is a blessing. Bending this malleable world towards justice and peace and your vision of what it could be is a blessing. But the nature of the universe is chaos. Never forget where you came from. So today, I'm turning us a bit from this consideration of the origins of the universe itself, the seeds that are planted, our dance with chaos and order, towards some consideration of our own congregation as we end our church year and begin to a new church year in July. And I just want to preface this by saying that some folks might think, is this the conversation that really matters today? And I simply want to say that it does matter. And hopefully by the end, we will all be reminded why. So we had a successful congregational meeting on Wednesday of this week. We had a quorum. We approved a budget for the coming year, and we elected our new board. Thank you to those who will be serving our congregation in the year ahead. Amy Beth Miller and Milo Stanojevic and Butch Bolton and Steve Perlmutter and Marilyn Finley. And we once again give our gratitude to Autumn Hall, who will be cycling off our board after serving for 3 years. Today, I'm going to be inviting us into a little bit of conversation about where we are as a congregation. And if you are newer with us, I hope you'll stick with it and ask questions if there are things you're wondering about or that don't make sense to you. So first, I want to bring our attention to the slide that I am sharing on my screen. One version of chaos in front of us. Lynn Unger's poem that we just heard reminds us that we come from chaos. The nature of the universe is chaos, she says. Never forget where you came from. And it is chaos in the biblical story of Genesis. It is the formless waters of the deep, in Hebrew called the tohu vavohu, the waters of the deep, like the waters of a womb, with the Spirit of God breathing and brooding over the waters. It is those chaotic waters out of which creation comes. In this wisdom story we heard a little while ago, it was described as a huge, deep, mysterious place, like something waiting to happen. Now, many feminist theologians, including Catherine Keller, have urged us to make friends with this place of chaos, with the face of the deep waters, because there would be no life without it. As much as we try to control chaos in our lives and in our world, it is better breathed upon, better breathed through, because chaos, when shaped with the Spirit, with breath, produces life and newness. Being reminded, especially on this morning, that the nature of the universe is fundamentally chaotic, we hope, actually. Being reminded of this after 2 years of pandemic gives me hope, actually. It means we can never predict the future. The future is always open, never foreclosed. We have some power and agency to shape it, to bend it, and that is a blessing. We have choice and agency, and that is a sacred blessing. Now, it is also good to be reminded that times of great chaos may be unsettling, may be scary, may make us frustrated and cranky, may make us ask existential questions like, does anything I do matter? But always, and here I want to turn to our organizational lives, our political lives, our civic lives, our congregational life, always it has been times of seeming chaos. Things aren't all under control, that have birthed new ideas, new connections, new power. Scientists who write about chaos theory tell us that when we are looking at a chaotic system, the weather, for instance, even tiny, tiny changes can lead to enormous differences down the line. Tiny, tiny seeds can grow to be something never imagined. This makes the weather and the world impossible to predict. The universe is not deterministic. The unfolding of time is not a straight line. God is not a man in the sky who simply put things in motion to play out along a predetermined pattern. Our very lives are a mix every day of chaos and order. Now, living with chaos is not easy. In fact, it can be quite traumatic, especially when the chaotic outweighs our sense of agency, our ability to shape our own world. And I would say that the last 2 years of this pandemic have brought this into stark relief for many of us who maybe didn't know that before, or who had never experienced that kind of chaos. This pandemic has been a collective traumatic event and has felt quite chaotic to many of us. We might say the same about the insurrection of January 6th as a collective traumatic event, or the collective traumatic events that we see increasingly, like floods or fires or hurricanes that are related to climate change. And of course, the collective traumatic events that many communities are reeling from with acts of gun violence. All of these interconnected in ways perhaps beyond our understanding. So people more experienced than me, more wiser than me, who have been working with congregations and communities over many years, have shared some of their wisdom about how communities process and move on from collective traumatic events. And this is the kind of learning that I often will share in a board meeting or just with leaders. And today I felt it important to share with the whole congregation. So this slide in front of you comes from an organization called the Institute for Collective Trauma and Growth. And it is meant to describe a general process for a community after a collective traumatic event. And it draws on and combines similar charts for healing after a natural disaster, as well as healing after human-caused disasters. Of course, this pandemic has been both a natural disaster and a human-caused disaster. Now, just so we're all on the same page, the American Psychological Association defines trauma as an emotional response to a terrible event. Immediately after the event, shock and denial are typical. Longer-term actions include unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, strained relationships, and even physical symptoms like headaches or nausea. And when I use the word trauma, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the emotional reaction to an event. Now, this chart has its limitations. Any way we try to make sense of big things in life have their limitations. For one thing, it's a single line moving from left to right, going up and down, right? And anybody who's been through a grief process, for instance, knows that it is not a linear process, right? It cycles back on itself. And I think that the up and down in this chart is trying to get at that. But this is just an approximation for us. Having watched many communities of what might be happening in places like congregations during this time, simply to help us see and understand general patterns. So some things I want to point out to you. You'll notice at the bottom, it says an estimated 24 to 60 month community process. That's 2 to 5 years after a collective traumatic event, that you can consider yourself in a process related to that event. You'll notice that after the first event, the precipitating event, there is something called a heroic phase. There is a sense of community cohesion. We are drawn together with a common purpose, and people really give even more of themselves to one another. But then there becomes a disillusionment phase. We move through what feels like disintegration, grief, wandering, maybe even chaos. Might feel like chaos before we are able to start moving towards a wiser living phase. And you can't get there without doing that first, without acknowledging grief and loss, without just perhaps breathing with the chaos of it, so that newness can arise. This rebuilding, and they use the word restoration. I would prefer to use the word transformation. This rebuilding and transformation phase is different because there's an awareness of loss. there's also an awareness of how heroic we can be with one another. There's a time for new initiatives and creations, but there's an acknowledgement that we will never be going back to exactly the way we were before. So each one of us might be able to relate to this chart as an individual, perhaps based on some individual experiences in our lives or our own process of dealing with these collective traumas that I've named. But I want to ask you all to think about and to share, if you're willing, in the chat today, in this 24 to 60 month, 2 to 5 year community process, where do you think we are now as a congregation? There's no right or wrong answer. Where are we feeling those ups and downs? And as you think about that and share in the chat, I'm just going to scroll through some photos from this last year. These are some photos that I shared at our congregational meeting on Wednesday, and I want to put them up in front of the whole gathered congregation today, just to remind us of the blessings of this congregation and the blessings of this last year. And then we'll return to this slide briefly. So the chat is open. I will be pulling it up for us as I scroll through these slides. I see one person naming that we are in a rebuilding and restoration phase. So reflecting some of what I'm seeing in the chat, some folks feel that we are in a time of rebuilding and restoration. Some folks feel that we are still in that time of disillusionment. Some folks are affirming that word of transformation instead of restoration. Maybe we are in the early part of rebuilding and restoration. And one person puts before us that maybe we are spiraling through all of them with traumas upon traumas, still transforming the earlier ones. It is hard, as Jennifer says, to separate thinking about one from the other. And yes, Gary is naming the big change and maybe somewhat traumatic for some of my leaving as minister of this congregation, just at the beginning of the process. It opens us for transformation. So thank you all who shared, and I invite you all to continue working with this model. It's just a framework. It's a model to help us make meaning out of this time and think about where we are. A couple of dynamics that I want to point out to you that might feel obvious. And I know we're going to go a little bit long on our worship service today, but thank you for hanging in. There will be some among us who will fervently want something to feel settled and stable right now. And there is nothing wrong with that. And I want to share with you, in addition to this wisdom that comes to us from the story of Genesis and from the story of the everything seed that we heard this morning, and the wisdom of chaos theorists, that sometimes we just have to breathe in the chaos before the newness arrives. It's related to a bit of wisdom I heard from a Nigerian-born scholar and teacher, Bayo Akomolafe, recently. He says, "These times are urgent. Let us slow down. These times are urgent. Let us slow down." And I want to give thanks that I think our leadership, the leadership of our congregation, has been following this kind of approach, this paradoxical advice already. I want us to remember that the people are the congregation. That together we can make friends with chaos, that we can together breathe and pay attention and shape the future with purpose, knowing that we can't totally control it, and letting go of feeling like we have to have everything settled and figured out to live out our mission. Let us remember that the people are the congregation, not the building, not a building, not the minister, not any minister, not a staff person, not a Zoom room, not a YouTube channel. Let us remember that nothing gives us more credibility or respectability in the community, or power in our congregation, or power in our community than real relationships, than simply being with one another, knowing one another, caring for one another, showing up for one another and our neighbors. And let us remember, in this time of chaos, as we turn, or maybe are already in those steps towards rebuilding and transformation, that every single time we gather, our congregation says these words, that we recommit ourselves to being true sanctuary, to being a place of life-saving welcome. So let us slow down, even though the times are urgent and we feel that urgency as we rebuild and consider what comes next through a ministerial transition, through great changes in our world. Let us slow down and root in these relationships. Seek what is life-giving as we center with the spirit of life, and remember what it means to provide real sanctuary. That's what I have to share with you all this morning. I love you, and I thank you for being part of this life-giving and life-saving community. Blessed be, and amen.